there's a quote from the reading that said, "Good moral thinking is disciplined thinking." And that's sort of the idea behind what we're going to talk about here. As you are introduced to ethics, I mentioned that ethics historically arises out of field from philosophy. Why that is because philosophy offers really particular opportunities to use certain language that we have used in this field for thousands of years in order to think about the question of what should I do. Before we start, I want to make a distinction that's not in, I don't think in this book, but it's one that you're going to come across, which is the distinction between rhetoric and reasoning. Rhetoric is how does it sound? If you take a rhetoric class, which you might take in communications, maybe in like a public speaking course, we'll talk about rhetoric. The point of rhetoric is making it sound good. That's different than what we're doing here by doing a disciplined thinking, by doing moral thinking, or by doing what this lecture is called, which is moral reasoning. Moral reasoning is about how true is it? And obviously something can be true and it can, obviously something can be true and it can sound good. I'm not acting like that doesn't happen all the time. But it doesn't necessarily mean it is so. There are probably all kinds of examples you can just think of where something sounds really good, but when you sit down and actually look at what they're saying, you're like, no, that is crazy, that's wrong. And vice versa. You know, I'm sure we all think certain things are super important, super valuable. More people should be talking about this. But because of who's delivering that information, not everyone always realizes that's the case. So certainly like that's a possibility. I recognize that rhetoric is important. If you, after this class, come to hold certain ethical views, obviously you're going to have to think about how am I going to tell people about all this glorious stuff I've learned in Professor Rossing's Intro to Ethics class. But the reasoning is what's important for today's lecture and really for this class. I'm going to put pressure on your reasoning much more than your rhetoric. But notice, if I ask you to critique someone, and you critique how the information sounds, how they present the information, and not the information itself, this is the content. This is the delivery. If you're criticizing the delivery and not the content, then you're not doing reasoning. You're not doing good ethics. You're allowing them to say whatever they have said is true, you just wish they would have said it differently. And if that's what you believe, that's fine. Recognize that that's what you're doing, at least. So that's a distinction I want to get out of the way just as we get into reasoning. But the reading says, so there's reasoning, the reading says there's reasoning, and that reasoning looks like, for the purposes of this class, looks like a bunch of arguments and reasons to believe those arguments. The author introduces a word that you need to know. The author introduces the word premise. Plural premises. Okay? So if I tell you, you should study for this class because you're going to get a better grade if you study, the argument is you should study for this class. The reason you believe that, or that I believe this, is my premise. So if the argument is you should study for this class, and the sentence is you should study for this class because it'll help you get a better grade, the premise, the reason I believe that, is because I think it will help you get a better grade. There is rhetoric and there is reasoning. Now there's arguments and there's premises. Rhetoric is how someone says something. Reasoning is how true what they're saying is. Argument is what they believe, and the premise is why they believe it. Does that make sense? Why do I care about this? If I tell you, you should study for this class because it will give you a better grade, and you disagree, I need to know where you disagreed. Let's say this is my sentence. You should study for this class because you will get a better grade. If you disagree with this part, that you will get a better grade because you study, you disagree with one of my premises. How would you say that in an assignment? Professor Rossing said that I will get a better grade if I study, and I think that's wrong because you disagreed with my premise, and that's fine. Notice that up here I also have separate. This is my argument. You can disagree with my argument, but this is what you would say. Professor Rossing said you should study for this class because you will get a better grade. I agree that I will get a better grade if I study, but I don't think that's enough evidence to prove I should study for this class. I believe this because I already have a grade that I'm happy with, and that time is spent better doing other things. Sure, that's fine with me. But you're saying something about you don't believe my premise is a strong enough reason to believe my argument. This is my argument. You should study for this class is my argument. What should I do? You should study for this class. That is my argument. That is my opinion. That is my belief. Because you will get a better grade. That is the reason I believe my argument. That is my premise. That's what a premise is. Okay? If you think you won't get a better grade if you study, then you disagree with my premise. You disagree with my argument before I even have told you why I believe it. So if I was going to ask you why you disagree with me, you say, I disagree with your claim, with your premise, that you will get a better grade. But you might well believe I will get a better grade if I study, but that might not be enough evidence for you that you should study. Yeah, I would get a better grade if I studied, but I think that my grade is fine enough and that time is better spent elsewhere. You think I don't have enough reasons to believe my argument. So you would say, you don't have sufficient evidence. I need more reasons. I need more premises. The final distinction I need to introduce you to is the difference between a valid argument and a sound argument. There's a lot of definitions for these online. For the purposes of this class, I'm going to simplify them. If an argument is valid, what you're telling me is if all of these premises are true, if everything you're saying is true, all of these reasons you believe this argument is true, that would be enough to convince me the argument is right. It might still be valid that if this was true or if it ever came to be true, yeah, I would believe in your argument. You have good enough reasons to believe your argument, but valid doesn't mean they're necessarily true. A valid argument is just saying, you've got enough evidence for me. If everything you're saying is true, I believe you. That's different than the example I gave you earlier. A valid argument is an argument where if all of the premises are true, that's enough evidence to believe the argument. If your person can prove to you all of the premises, everything they say is true, they can prove it is true, that's enough to convince you that their argument's right. Sound argument, I wrote here true and sufficient. That means not only is it enough evidence if it's true, it actually is true. So that person has not only proved to you that their premises do sufficiently add credence to their argument, but a sound argument goes further as to say they've proven that it is true. Why is this distinction important? This premise might be something like, God exists. The existence of a God changes for a lot of people what they believe. So you could say, if you're right that God exists, and let's say you as a reader believe he doesn't, if you're right, that would be enough reason to believe what your opinion is. But I don't believe it, so it's not enough for me. That is still a valid argument. That's different than saying you agree with them. Obviously, the goal of when you're talking to someone about this stuff is you want them to not only agree that everything you said is true, but you also want them to agree that that's enough to prove your point. But there is still value. If someone tells you something and you go, look, I know that you believe this, and if I did believe that, that would be enough evidence for me to agree with your final point. Don't believe that premise, that reason you believe this. Then I think your argument's valid. It makes total sense because you believe this. It makes total sense to me why you've come to your argument. So your argument's valid, but I don't think it's sound because I think this one idea is not true. All sound arguments are first valid. Validity of an argument is dependent on, is there enough rational force? Do their reasons sufficiently prove their argument? So if you disagree with the truth of a reason, but agree if it were true, that would be enough to prove the final point. You believe that argument is valid. If you think none of that is true, you think the argument is neither valid nor sound. If I tell you it is raining monkeys from the sky, and because it is raining monkeys from the sky, we should all go outdoors, you are sitting here going, well, I don't think it's raining monkeys, but even if it were raining monkeys, the last thing I would do is go outdoors. Then you're like, that argument is invalid, that argument is not sound. If I were to tell you, I think it's raining monkeys, because I think it's raining monkeys, I'm going to take shelter, then you could be like, yeah, if it were raining monkeys, that would be enough to convince me that I should take shelter. Valid argument, dude. That's valid. But I don't think it's raining monkeys. So it's not sound. I don't think it's true. But if it were true, that would be enough to convince me. It's a nuanced distinction, but important. Those are the distinctions I want you to know. Rhetoric versus reasoning. What we are trying to do is reasoning. How we'll do reasoning is by looking at opinions, by looking at arguments, analyzing why people believe them, and then asking ourselves, well, if that's true, would I believe that? If that is enough work, then it's a valid argument. And then going, well, is that even true? Then we'll determine if it's sound. Rhetoric is how the argument sounds. Reasoning is the actual work of creating and analyzing arguments. Arguments are the opinions that you want to establish as true or help others believe. Premises are the reasons you believe them. And those opinions or arguments are either valid, they're logically valid, and they might be logically sound.